The Avengers that exists is one of the most successful films ever made. $1.5 billion at the global box office. The film that proved a shared cinematic universe could actually work at scale. The moment Marvel stopped being a gamble and became a phenomenon. Looking back at it now, it is easy to treat it as inevitable. Of course it worked. Of course the heroes assembled. Of course Loki was the villain, and Whedon directed, and Ruffalo played Banner. And the whole thing came together the way it did. None of it was inevitable. Almost none of it was even planned. Because the Avengers that almost got made looked nothing like the one that ended up in theaters. Different director, different villain, different team members, a Hulk played by a completely different actor who spent years assuming he would be in the film, a Black Widow who was nearly replaced by an entirely different hero, and a first draft that the man who eventually directed the film told Marvel to pretend never existed. Today we are going inside all of it. The decisions, the fallouts, the near misses, and the version of this story that the world never got to see. It starts like so many things in the early MCU with Jon Favreau. When Favreau signed on to direct Iron Man, his plan for the character extended well beyond the first film. He wanted to introduce the Mandarin as Iron Man's primary antagonist. The Mandarin is one of the most significant villains in Iron Man's comic book history, a figure whose combination of technological genius and mystical power made him a natural counterpart to Tony Stark. Favreau saw him as the villain the franchise was building toward. Comic book writer Mark Millar talked him out of it. The argument was straightforward. Favreau's approach to Iron Man was grounded in a way that felt deliberate. The technology was real enough to be believed. The world operated by rules the audience could follow. The Mandarin and his 10 magical rings belonged to a different register entirely, one that would have clashed with the tone Favreau was carefully establishing. Miller felt the character would feel out of place, and Favreau agreed, pivoting to Obadiah Stane as the villain after Jeff Bridges was cast. But Favreau did not abandon the Mandarin entirely. He saved him. His thinking was that once Thor and the magical dimensions of the Norse mythology entered the MCU, the fantastical elements of the Mandarin would no longer feel jarring. He compared it to the Emperor in Return of the Jedi, whose Force lightning might have felt completely out of place in A New Hope, but landed perfectly once the audience had been prepared for that level of mythology. The Mandarin would work when the world was ready for him, and Favreau planned to be in the director's chair when that moment arrived. Because in his vision, the third Iron Man film was also going to be The Avengers. That vision did not survive Iron Man 2. The sequel became the moment the relationship between Favreau and Marvel fractured in ways that would reshape the entire direction of the MCU. Marvel interfered heavily with the production, pushing the film into service of the larger Avengers setup in ways that compromised its identity as a standalone story. Favreau described it later as being turned into an infomercial for the Avengers. The film was rushed into production without a fully realized script. The creative control that had made the first Iron Man feel like a director's film evaporated under the pressure of building a universe on a schedule. The negotiations to bring Favreau back were lengthy and difficult. He felt undervalued after being largely responsible for establishing the tone and credibility of the entire MCU with the first film. They eventually reached an agreement, but the experience left a mark on both sides. Marvel decided they did not want to pay that kind of money to a director again, and made a deliberate choice to find an up-and-coming filmmaker they could bring in for significantly less. Favreau, for his part, had little appetite for directing the Avengers if it meant facing the same level of interference that had frustrated him throughout Iron Man 2. The idea of going from creating and owning that world to simply being Happy Hogan in someone else's version of it was, in his own words, strange to consider. So Favreau stepped back, and Marvel turned to the script that had been in development for 4 years already. Zach Penn had been hired to write The Avengers, while Phase 1 was still taking shape around him. It was an almost impossible assignment. He was writing toward a finish line that kept moving as new films entered production and new casting decisions changed what was possible. He spent 4 years drafting and redrafting while Thor and Captain America were still being developed, before anyone knew whether those films would work, before the characters had been properly established on screen. Penn shared Favreau's concern about the tonal gap between Iron Man's grounded high-tech world and the mythological fantasy of Thor. His solution was to significantly reduce Thor's role in the film. In Penn's version, Thor was a character who should have his own solo film first and then debut in the Avengers, rather than arriving fully formed in an ensemble. But the larger and more surprising difference in Penn's draft was the villain. It was not Loki. Penn had been developing Red Skull as the primary antagonist for the Avengers. This was not an accident or a casual idea. It was baked into the architecture of Captain America's ending. Red Skull was not killed at the end of that film. He was transported through a portal by the Tesseract, an ending deliberately left open so that he could return as the threat the Avengers would assemble to face. Hugo Weaving, who played Red Skull, had signed up for 3 pictures operating on the assumption that this was exactly where his character was heading. The groundwork had been laid. The return was planned. Then Chris Hemsworth was cast as Thor, and Tom Hiddleston was cast as Loki. And everything changed again. Because once Hemsworth stepped into the role, it became immediately clear that Thor was not a character who needed to be minimized or introduced carefully. He was a natural anchor for the ensemble. And once Hiddleston brought Loki to life, the question of who should be the villain in the Avengers stopped being a conversation. Loki was the answer. Penn even wrote a scene where the assembled heroes attempt to lift Thor's hammer, a sequence that never made it into the Avengers, but eventually found its way into Age of Ultron almost a decade later. Red Skull's return was quietly shelved. The villain, who had been transported through a portal specifically to set up his next appearance, disappeared from the plan entirely, and Penn turned his attention to a different problem: the Hulk and the actor playing him. Edward Norton was not supposed to leave the MCU. Zack Penn wanted him back and assumed he would return the same way Downey and Hemsworth and Evans were all being assembled. The problem was that Norton's relationship with Marvel had never been smooth. When Norton was cast as Banner, he asked to rewrite Penn's Incredible Hulk script. Feige and Leterrier both agreed the script needed work, so Norton's involvement was welcomed initially. But the rewriting continued throughout filming on his own initiative, creating tension with the director and the rest of the cast. When the final edit omitted scenes Norton had written, he threatened not to promote the film unless Marvel restored them. That threat ended the relationship. Feige moved on publicly and pointedly, emphasizing the need for someone who embodied the collaborative spirit Marvel's other cast members had demonstrated. Left without a confirmed Banner, Penn rewrote the Avengers so Bruce barely appeared, instead writing scenes for the Hulk alone, including a New York rampage the assembled heroes would have to stop. Leterrier had actually prepared for this possibility. The final shot of the Incredible Hulk, Banner opening his eyes and smirking, was left deliberately ambiguous so it could be read as Banner losing control. The door was left open intentionally. Eventually, Mark Ruffalo replaced Norton, and the Hulk was redesigned to actually resemble the actor playing him, with Ruffalo performing the motion capture himself. Then Whedon arrived and told Feige to pretend Penn's draft never existed. Feige agreed with one condition: the structure would remain and Loki would stay as the villain. Penn received a story by credit for 4 years of work, a credit Whedon contested, and which Penn later noted cost him millions in bonus money. The first pressure Whedon faced came from Downey. Stark needed to be the lead in the opening sequence, driving the entire film. Whedon tried it. The movie originally opened with Iron Man battling a throwaway villain. It did not work. Whedon rebuilt the film around his ensemble philosophy instead, arguing that each hero should function as an arm of the octopus rather than one character carrying the rest. Whedon also worried Loki alone was not a convincing enough threat. His solution was Ezekiel Stane, Obadiah's son, who would have aided Loki while pursuing his own revenge against Tony. Feige read it and said no, immediately and finally. Black Widow nearly disappeared from the film entirely. Emily Blunt had originally been offered the role for Iron Man 2, but was contractually committed elsewhere and had to turn it down. Johansson replaced her. But as the Avengers entered development, Johansson had potential scheduling conflicts that threatened her availability. Rather than wait, Whedon rewrote the script around the Wasp, a founding Avengers member from the comics. He became genuinely invested, later admitting he had overcompensated and rewritten the film to be substantially about her. A senior Marvel executive described the Wasp version as the funniest character in the whole movie. Zoe Saldana was considered for the role. When Johansson's conflicts were resolved, Whedon had to scramble again, removing the Wasp and restoring Black Widow. Hawkeye had a similar problem. Introduced briefly in Thor, with almost nothing established about him, Whedon wrote an extensive backstory, a circus performer trained by criminals and manipulated into fighting against the team. None of it made the cut. Time constraints made it impossible to reference, and the backstory exists only in documents nobody will likely ever see. The shawarma line came from somewhere nobody would have predicted. The original script had Tony waking up after the battle and asking what's next. On the day they shot it, Downey decided the line was not good enough and asked Whedon for something funnier on the spot. Whedon's mind went back to an audition Nicholas Brendon gave for Xander on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. After finishing the audition, Brendon had turned to the room and said, "Does anyone feel like shawarma? I feel like some shawarma."
You ever tried shawarma? There's a shawarma joint about 2 blocks from here. I don't know what it is, but I want to try it.
One complication. Evans had grown a beard for Snowpiercer. The prosthetic jaw fitted over his beard looked unconvincing and made eating impossible. This is why Cap is covering his face with his hand in that scene. He physically could not eat without the prosthetic becoming visible. Looking back at how close the Avengers came to being something completely unrecognizable is genuinely difficult to process. Penn was advised by people in the industry not to take the assignment because the project was going to fail and would damage his career. What eventually reached theaters was the product of a decade of accumulated decisions, reversals, replacements, and rewrites. A discarded director, a villain written in and then abandoned, an actor who spent years assuming he would be there and was not, a hero replaced and then restored, a joke from a Buffy audition that became the most quoted line in the film. None of it was inevitable. All of it mattered, and somehow, against every odd, it became the film that changed what movies could be.